Daniel Foster's Ferragamo loafers echoed to the marble halls of Manhattan Supreme Court as he reviewed the pharmaceutical defense brief that would make or break his career. The $600 million class action lawsuit against Meridian Pharmaceuticals had already consumed 18 months of his life, and closing arguments were 24 hours away. His paralegal fiancée, Jessica, walked beside him, her Chanel bag swinging as she rattled off the evening's plans. A charity gala at the plaza where every partner at Whitmore and Sterling would watch him either ascend to glory or crash in spectacular failure. The pressure sat like a stone in his chest, but Daniel had never lost a case this big, and he wasn't about to start now. Everything he'd worked for since leaving a working-class Brooklyn neighborhood for Harvard Law hung in the balance. The courthouse cafeteria smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner as Daniel claimed his usual bench, spreading documents across the worn-wood surface. A woman in a maintenance uniform pushed a mop past him, and he barely registered her presence. Just another invisible worker in the building's daily choreography. Jessica laughed into her phone, probably sharing gossip with the other paralegals about how stressed Daniel had become, how he barely slept, how victory in this case would secure their future. The afternoon sun slanted through grimy windows, casting shadows across pages of expert testimony, medical studies, and legal precedents that his team of 12 associates had assembled. Daniel took a bite of his overpriced sandwich and tried to ignore the gnawing feeling that something the defense was missing, some crucial piece he couldn't identify. "Excuse me, sir, you dropped something," the janitor said, extending a folded paper napkin toward him with work-worn hands. Daniel glanced up, annoyed at the interruption, and saw a woman with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, probably in her mid-30s, with kind brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. Jessica smirked and stage-whispered to her phone friend about the cleaning lady's audacity to interrupt an attorney during his lunch break. Daniel took the napkin without looking at it, muttered a distracted thanks, and turned back to his documents while the janitor returned to mopping the floor in smooth, methodical strokes. The moment passed unremarkably, just another interaction in a building full of lawyers too important to see the people who kept it running. But inside that folded napkin was a message that would change everything. Hello, my friends. Before we continue our story, leave your like, share the story, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Daniel Foster had built his reputation on being the smartest attorney in any room, the guy who worked harder and thought faster than anyone else at Whitmore and Sterling. The 73rd floor corner office overlooking Central Park had been his reward for winning the Holbrook merger case last year, $2.3 billion in assets protected, zero liability exposure, a partnership track that made him the envy of every associate in Manhattan. His tailored Tom Ford suit cost more than his father's monthly pension, a fact that simultaneously filled him with pride and a guilt he'd learned to suppress with expensive scotch and longer work hours. The Meridian Pharmaceutical defense was supposed to be his crowning achievement, the case that would cement his legacy before age 40 and make Jessica's dream wedding at the Met Cloisters a reality. But something had changed in recent weeks. The thrill of victory fell hollow, the praise from senior partners rang false, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd done something that actually mattered beyond billable hours. His desk held framed photos of successes, shaking hands with grateful CEO, accepting an award from a New York Bar Association, posing with Jessica at last year's firm retreat in the Hamptons. Jessica Martin had been with the firm for 3 years, a paralegal with ambitions to become an attorney herself, though Daniel noticed she spent more time networking at charity events than studying for the LSAT. She was beautiful in that polished, Upper East Side way, highlights that cost $600 every 6 weeks, personal trainer sessions at Equinox, a capsule wardrobe from Bergdorf's that she rotated with military precision. Their engagement had been strategic as much as romantic, announced at the firm's annual gala 6 months ago, with senior partner Richard Whitmore toasting their future with Dom Perignon and knowing smiles. Daniel knew office relationships were complicated, but Jessica understood the demands of corporate law, never complained about his 16-hour days, and looked perfect on his arm at every firm function. Still, sometimes he caught himself wondering if this was really the life he dreamed about in that cramped Brooklyn apartment where his mother worked double shifts as a nurse and his father hauled garbage for city. The Meridian case dominated his every waking moment, a class action lawsuit claiming the company's diabetes drug caused liver failure in 247 patients. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had hired Whitmore and Sterling to defend against $600 million in damages, and Daniel led a team of 12 attorneys who'd spent months building a defense around expert testimony and statistical analysis. The plaintiffs' lawyers were good, relentless even, but Daniel's team had assembled a fortress of data showing the liver failures were pre-existing conditions not caused by the medication. His strategy was elegant. Discredit the plaintiff's expert witness, Dr. Marcus Chun, whose testimony claimed causation based on a comprehensive metabolic study published in the Journal of Clinical Medicine. If he could create reasonable doubt about Chen's conclusions, the jury would have no choice but to find for Meridian. Everything hinged on tomorrow's closing arguments. 8 years of legal training compressed into 2 hours that would either elevate him to legend or destroy his career. The pressure was exquisite, terrible, intoxicating. Jessica had planned the evening meticulously. The charity gala at the plaza benefiting some children's hospital, where half of Manhattan's legal elite would gather to see and be seen. She'd ordered a new Valentino gown, made hair and nail appointments at Warren Trikami, and spent the past week coaching Daniel on which partners to schmooze and which cases to mention. The gala was networking disguised as charity, and Jessica played the game better than anyone he knew, always knowing whose hand to shake and whose glass to refill. Daniel found these events exhausting but necessary. The cost of admission to the world he'd fought so hard to enter. He'd tried explaining to his parents that success in corporate law wasn't just about legal skills. It was about relationships, reputation, and being seen in the right places with the right people. His mother had nodded politely, but he'd seen the disappointment in her eyes, the unspoken question about whether he'd traded his values for Valentino gowns and partnership tracks. He pushed those thoughts away and focused on the case, on the closing arguments he'd rehearsed 50 times, on the victory that would silence every doubt. But beneath the confidence and expensive suits, Daniel felt a nagging emptiness he couldn't quite name. He'd won every case that mattered, made more money than his parents ever dreamed of, and secured a future that should have felt triumphant. Yet sometimes late at night, reviewing depositions in his Tribeca loft, he'd remember why he'd gone to law school in the first place. The desire to help people, to use the law as a shield for the powerless, to be the kind of attorney his neighborhood needed when landlords tried illegal evictions or immigrants faced deportation without due process. That idealistic kid from Brooklyn felt like a stranger now, someone he'd left behind along with the accent he'd trained himself to lose and the calloused hands that came from working construction summers to pay for college. His father had been so proud when Daniel got the Harvard Law acceptance letter, had framed it on the living room wall next to his mother's nursing degree. Daniel wondered what that father would think of the attorney he'd become, brilliant, ruthless, defending pharmaceutical companies for $1,500 an hour, while people in his old neighborhood couldn't afford basic health care. The thought made him reach for his scotch glass, swallow the guilt, and return to Meridian brief with renewed intensity. The afternoon stretched into evening as Daniel prepared for tomorrow's performance, because that's what closing arguments really were. Theater with legal citations, emotion calibrated for maximum jury impact. His team had done everything right. Discredited opposing experts, presented alternative causation theories, and built a narrative that the plaintiffs were opportunistic people looking for lottery payouts from a responsible company. The strategy was solid, the execution flawless, and yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling he'd overlooked something crucial. He'd review the expert testimony one more time tonight, double-check every citation, and walk into that courtroom tomorrow, knowing he'd left nothing to chance. Victory was everything in corporate law. Not truth, not justice, just winning for the client who paid the bills. Richard Whitmore had taught him that lesson early. Sympathy was for legal aid lawyers making $60,000 a year. Power players defended whoever could afford a retainer. Daniel had learned the lesson well, built a career on it, and the rewards had been substantial. Tomorrow would prove whether he truly belonged in Manhattan's legal elite, or was just a Brooklyn kid playing dress-up in someone else's suit. Jessica called at 7 p.m., her voice bright with excitement about the gala, reminding him they needed to leave by 8:30 for the pre-event cocktails. Daniel assured her he'd be ready, mentally calculating how many documents he could review in 90 minutes and still have time to shower and change. The courthouse cafeteria lunch felt like days ago, though it had only been this afternoon. Had he even looked at that napkin the janitor had handed him? He searched his briefcase, finding it crumpled at the bottom, still folded. Probably just a note about a drop receipt or something equally mundane. Daniel smoothed it open, ready to toss it, and felt his world tilt as he read the careful handwriting. The Chin study cites data from Martinelli et al. 2019. That study was retracted in 2021 for fabricated data. Your expert witness billed his testimony on fraudulent research. The judge needs to know before closing arguments. The note was unsigned, written in blue ballpoint pen on a courthouse cafeteria napkin, and if it was true, it was the nuclear bomb that would win the case. Daniel's hand started shaking as he grabbed his laptop, pulling up the Journal of Clinical Medicine database, searching for the Martinelli study, and finding the retraction notice dated March 2021. 3 years ago, buried in a database his entire team of 12 lawyers had somehow missed. The cleaning lady had just saved his career. Carmen Rodriguez pushed her maintenance cart to the courthouse halls, the industrial cleaning supplies clanking softly with each step as fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The night shift suited her perfectly. Fewer people meant less chance of running into someone from her former life, back when she'd walked these halls in Armani suits instead of a maintenance uniform with her name embroidered on the pocket. She'd been cleaning the Manhattan Supreme Court building for 3 years now, ever since the blacklist made it impossible to practice corporate law anywhere in New York City. The irony wasn't lost on her. A Columbia Law graduate with bar admission in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, spending her nights mopping floors in the same building where she'd once argued motions before judges who no longer acknowledged her existence. But Carmen had learned that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford, not when rent was due and pro bono civil rights cases didn't pay for groceries or her mother's medications. The courthouse at night became a different world, silent except for security guards making rounds and the occasional late-night attorney preparing for trial in one of the public conference rooms. Carmen had perfected the art of invisibility, of being present without being seen, just another worker in the building's infrastructure that kept justice machinery functioning. She'd noticed Daniel Foster weeks ago, recognizing him from his appellate victory in the Holbrook case that had made headlines in the New York Law Journal. He was brilliant. Everyone said so. Sharp legal mind, impeccable preparation, the kind of attorney Carmen had once aspired to become before everything collapsed. She'd watched him work in the cafeteria during lunch breaks, spreading documents across the bench, so focused he barely noticed the world around him, including the janitor who emptied his trash and wiped down tables 3 feet away. The pharmaceutical case he was defending had become her guilty fascination. She'd read the public filings, studied the expert testimony, and noticed the problem his entire legal team had somehow missed. Carmen knew she should have stayed silent, should have kept her head down, and her opinions to herself like she'd learned to do after the blacklist. Speaking up had destroyed her career once already. Reporting senior partner Malcolm Harrington for burying evidence in a wrongful death case had seemed like the only ethical choice, right up until she was fired for performance issues and blacklisted from every major firm in the city. The New York Bar Association had investigated her complaint, found insufficient evidence, and moved on while Carmen's reputation lay in ruins from whisper campaigns about being difficult, unstable, someone who couldn't handle the pressure of corporate law. Malcolm Harrington was still a named partner at Preston and Barnes, still defending corporations against liability, still burying evidence whenever it served his clients. Meanwhile, Carmen cleaned toilets and fought pro bono deportation cases for immigrants who couldn't afford attorneys, because apparently that's what happened when you chose ethics over careerism in corporate America. The bitterness had faded over 3 years, replaced by something harder and more focused, a determination to use her legal mind however she could, even if that meant leaving anonymous notes on attorneys' briefcases. The Martinelli study retraction had jumped out at her immediately when she glanced at the documents Foster left spread across the cafeteria bench yesterday. She'd been wiping down the next table, and her legal training made it impossible not to scan the expert testimony pages she saw, the way a musician can't help hearing wrong notes in a symphony. Dr. Chen's testimony cited Martinelli's 2019 metabolic study as foundational to his causation theory, but Carmen knew that study had been retracted 2 years ago when peer review discovered the principal investigator had fabricated patient data to secure pharmaceutical industry funding. The retraction had been major news in legal circles. She'd read about it in the Journal of the American Medical Association while working a case involving expert witness credibility. Foster's team had missed it, probably because they focused on attacking Chen's methodology rather than investigating his sources, and the mistake would likely cost Foster the case and his client $600 million. Carmen had debated whether to say anything, knowing that interrupting an attorney during lunch to offer unsolicited legal advice would make her seem crazy or presumptuous or both. So she'd written the note instead, folded it into a napkin, and handed it to him with the pretense that he'd dropped something. She'd seen his fiancée's smirk, heard the whispered comment about the cleaning lady thinking she understood contract law, and felt the familiar sting of being dismissed by people who'd never know her story. Jessica Martin was everything Carmen used to be: polished, ambitious, perfectly styled for success in Manhattan legal circles. Except Jessica had the luxury of that success without having to sacrifice her principles to keep it. Carmen had watched Jessica at firm events covered in the legal press, always photographed next to Daniel Foster, always positioning herself in the center of power. There was something calculating in Jessica's eyes that Carmen recognized from her own time in corporate law, the ambition that prioritized advancement over everything else, including ethics. But that wasn't Carmen's concern anymore. She delivered the information Foster needed to win his case, and what he did with it was his choice. She returned to her maintenance cart, pulling out the mop and bucket, and began the methodical work of cleaning floors and hallways where she'd once commanded respect. The Columbia Law diploma sat in a storage unit in Queens, along with her Armani suits and a naive belief that merit and ethics matter more than politics and power. Her small apartment in Astoria was a far cry from the Upper West Side one-bedroom she'd rented as a rising associate, but Carmen had learned to find contentment in simplicity. The walls held photos of her family. Her mother, who'd immigrated from Mexico at 18, worked as a seamstress, and saved every penny to send Carmen to college. Her younger brothers, who'd served in the military and now worked as teachers in the Bronx. They didn't fully understand what happened to Carmen's career, just knew she'd done the right thing and suffered for it, which made them proud even as they worried about her working a janitorial job with a law degree. Carmen spent her mornings on pro bono civil rights cases, defending tenants against predatory landlords, representing undocumented immigrants in deportation hearings, fighting the small battles that made actual differences in people's lives even if they'd never make headlines or earn six-figure fees. This was a law she dreamed of practicing at Columbia, before corporate recruiters had seduced her with prestige and starting salaries that could pay off student loans in 3 years. The irony was that losing everything had returned her to that original dream, even if the path looked nothing like she'd imagined. Tonight she finished her shift at 2 a.m., hung up her maintenance uniform in the courthouse locker room, and walked to the subway in jeans and a Columbia Law hoodie that had faded from navy to gray. The N train was mostly empty at this hour, a few night shift workers heading home, a couple of drunk businessmen in loosened ties, a mother with 2 sleeping children slumped against her shoulders. Carmen pulled out her laptop, reviewing notes for tomorrow's immigration hearing in Queens, a Guatemalan father facing deportation despite living in New York for 15 years, working construction, paying taxes, and raising 3 American citizen children. The case was complex, the odds terrible, but Carmen had found a procedural issue that might buy them time to file for asylum based on gang violence in Guatemala's Western Highlands. This was law that mattered, even if it happened in cramped immigration courtrooms instead of mahogany panel boardrooms. The train rattled through dark tunnels, and Carmen wondered if Daniel Foster had found her note, if he'd investigated the retraction, if he'd used the information to win his case. She'd probably never know. Attorneys like Foster didn't send thank you notes to janitors, even janitors who just handed them a $600 million victory. But that was fine. Carmen had stopped expecting recognition years ago. The work was its own reward, and helping anyone, was better than staying silent just to protect herself. The Plaza's grand ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers of Manhattan's legal aristocracy, but Daniel couldn't focus on schmoozing or Jessica's carefully orchestrated networking strategy. The Martinelli retraction bombshell had consumed his thoughts all evening. He'd spent 2 hours confirming the information, pulling the original study, reading the retraction notice, and verifying that Dr. Chin had indeed built his entire causation theory on fabricated data. His expert rebuttal witness, Dr. Sarah Morrison, would need to be briefed immediately. The motion to strike Chen's testimony would need to be filed by 8 a.m., and Daniel's closing arguments would need complete restructuring to emphasize this devastating credibility blow. The janitor's note had transformed the case from difficult but winnable to a guaranteed victory, assuming the judge allowed the retraction evidence. Richard Whitmore was going to lose his mind with joy when Daniel dropped this bomb in court tomorrow. But first, Daniel had to survive this charity gala without revealing anything to opposing counsel, who were circulating to the crowd looking smug about their supposedly airtight case. Jessica gripped his arm tightly, steering him toward a cluster of Whitmore and Sterling partners near the champagne fountain, her Valentino gown drawing appreciative glances from attorneys whose wives had opted for safer Chanel. She was in her element here, laughing at senior partner jokes, complimenting wife jewelry with specific designer knowledge that impressed them, positioning Daniel for maximum visibility while she worked the room. Daniel had to admit she was brilliant at this social chess game, knowing instinctively which conversations mattered and which were time wasters, always keeping one eye on who was talking to whom and what alliances were forming in real time. She'd been pushing him toward Richard Whitmore all evening, trying to engineer a casual conversation where Daniel could drop hints about being confident in tomorrow's closing arguments without revealing the nuclear weapon he'd just acquired. But Daniel couldn't stop thinking about the courthouse cafeteria, about the janitor who'd noticed something 12 lawyers missed, about how she'd known to check for retractions when his entire team had focused on attacking methodologies. Who was she, and how had someone working as maintenance spotted a retracted study that required access to medical journal databases and knowledge of expert witness testimony patterns? Daniel, are you even listening? Jessica hissed through her smile, nodding at Richard Whitmore, who was approaching them with his wife, Charlotte. Daniel snapped back to attention, putting on the confident attorney mask he perfected over 8 years of practice, shaking Whitmore's hand firmly, while assuring him that tomorrow's closing arguments would deliver the victory Meridian Pharmaceuticals deserved. Whitmore beamed, already half-drunk on expensive champagne, and the prospect of earning massive fees from pharmaceutical industry referrals if Daniel won this case. Charlotte Whitmore complimented Jessica's gown and asked about wedding plans, triggering Jessica's well-rehearsed response about the Met Cloisters venue and destination honeymoon in St. Bart's. Daniel played his part, smiling at the right moments, making appropriate comments about the charity benefiting children's hospitals, all while his mind raced through tomorrow's revised strategy. The retraction evidence was so damaging that plaintiff's counsel might try to settle immediately once Daniel filed a motion. $600 million in potential damages reduced to maybe $50 million tops, a stunning victory that would make Daniel's partnership practically guaranteed. The evening dragged on with endless courses of food Daniel barely tasted. Seared scallops, truffle risotto, wagyu beef that probably cost $200 a plate, while children in his old Brooklyn neighborhood ate ramen for dinner. The irony of eating lavishly at a charity gala, supposedly raising money for sick kids, wasn't lost on him. But everyone here understood this was really about networking and seeing who donated the most conspicuously. Jessica had insisted they buy a table for $50,000. Money Daniel didn't really have, but couldn't refuse to spend if he wanted to maintain the appearance of success. Credit card debt was an investment in future partnership profits. Jessica had argued, and she was probably right about the calculation, even if the ethics felt queasy. Daniel's phone buzzed with texts from his legal team, associates confirming they reviewed the Martinelli retraction, Dr. Morrison agreeing to revise her expert testimony to include this new information, paralegals drafting the motion to strike Chen's testimony. Everything was falling into place for tomorrow's courtroom triumph. Yet Daniel couldn't shake the image of that janitor, couldn't stop wondering about her story. "You seem distracted tonight," Jessica observed on the cab ride home, her tone carrying a hint of annoyance that he hadn't been performing at peak schmooze capacity. Daniel explained he was focused on the case, on tomorrow's closing arguments that would require every ounce of concentration. Jessica softened, touching his face affectionately, telling him she was so proud of how hard he'd worked on Meridian, how she couldn't wait to see him destroy the plaintiff's case. She'd taken the afternoon off to attend the trial, wanted to be there for his moment of triumph, and had already arranged for their engagement to be featured in the New York Law Journal Society section after his inevitable victory. Daniel appreciated her support even as something about her enthusiasm felt hollow, performative, more about how his success reflected on her than actual interest in the legal complexities. But maybe that was unfair. Jessica had been with him through brutal work weeks, had tolerated his stress and distraction, and deserved to enjoy tomorrow's victory as much as he did. He kissed her forehead and promised to make partner before their wedding, securing the future they both worked toward. Back in his Tribeca loft, Daniel poured a scotch and reviewed the motion to strike one final time, ensuring every citation was perfect and every argument airtight. The retraction evidence was devastating. Dr. Chen had built his entire causation theory on a study later proven to be fabricated, which destroyed his credibility and left plaintiffs with no expert testimony to support their claims. The judge would have no choice but to strike Chen's testimony, and without it, plaintiffs couldn't prove causation between Meridian's drug and the liver failures. Daniel's victory was practically assured, $600 million in damages avoided, and his career trajectory secured. Yet the triumph felt strange, unearned somehow, because the real brilliance hadn't come from him or his 12 lawyers. It had come from a janitor whose name he didn't even know. The note was still in his briefcase, written on a courthouse cafeteria napkin in careful blue ink, and Daniel found himself reading it again, studying the handwriting for clues about the person who'd saved his case. The writing was precise, educated, confident, not what he'd expect from maintenance staff. What was her story, and why had she helped him? Sleep came fitfully that night, Daniel's dreams mixing courtroom triumph with images of the janitor mopping floors while he dismissed her as invisible. He woke at 5 a.m., showered, dressed in his Lucky Hugo boss suit, and reviewed closing arguments one final time. Today would determine everything: his partnership, his reputation, his entire future in corporate law. The case was winnable now, practically a guaranteed victory, and all because someone he'd barely noticed had cared enough to leave a note. Daniel made a mental note to find her after the trial, to thank her properly, and maybe even compensate her for the research that had saved him. It was the least he could do for someone who'd given him a gift more valuable than gold, the evidence that would win his career-defining case. But first, he had to walk into that courtroom and deliver the closing arguments of his life. The plaintiff's expert witness was about to be destroyed, publicly humiliated with fabricated data, and Daniel Foster was going to be the attorney who exposed it all. Victory had never tasted so certain. The Manhattan Supreme Court courtroom buzzed with pre-trial energy as Daniel entered at 7:30 a.m., his legal team arranged behind him like chess pieces on a board. The motion to strike Dr. Chen's testimony had been filed at 8:01 a.m., catching plaintiff's counsel completely off guard judging from the frantic phone, calls they were making in the hallway. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to his expert witness, Dr. Sarah Morrison, just one of those legal coincidences, sat behind her bench reviewing the motion with the focused intensity that made her one of the most respected jurists in New York. Daniel's heart pounded with anticipation as he watched her read through the retraction evidence, saw her eyebrows rise as she understood the implications, and waited for the ruling that would devastate the plaintiff's case. Jessica sat in the gallery looking radiant and proud, already mentally spending his partnership bonus. Richard Whitmore had texted at 6 a.m. demanding updates, and Daniel had assured him that victory was imminent. Everything hinged on the next 20 minutes. Judge Morrison called both counsels to the bench, her expression grave as she held up Daniel's motion. "Mr. Foster, this is extraordinary evidence. When did you discover the Martinelli retraction?" Daniel explained that he learned of it yesterday evening, had verified it through multiple databases, and had immediately assembled his team to investigate its impact on Dr. Chen's testimony. The judge turned to plaintiff's counsel Mark Davidson, whose face had gone pale as he realized his expert's testimony was built on fabricated data. Davidson stammered that his team had relied on Dr. Chen's credentials and hadn't independently verified every source citation, which was standard practice in complex litigation. Judge Morrison's voice cut through his excuses like a blade. Standard practice is thorough research counsel. Dr. Chen built his causation theory on fraudulent data. That's not a minor oversight. It's fundamental to his credibility as an expert witness. I'm inclined to grant Mr. Foster's motion to strike. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Davidson pleaded for time to find alternative expert testimony. But everyone knew the case was over. The ruling came down at 8:47 a.m. Dr. Chen's testimony was stricken from the record, and without it, plaintiffs lacked sufficient evidence to prove causation between Meridian's drug and the liver failures. Judge Morrison scheduled a hearing for next week on Meridian's motion for directed verdict, but the outcome was already decided. Daniel had won the $600 million case through a single piece of evidence his entire legal team had missed, but a courthouse janitor had spotted. The victory sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Plaintiffs' families crying and attorneys scrambling to calculate settlement offers that might salvage something from a wreckage. Richard Whitmore burst through the courtroom doors, having rushed over from the office when Daniel texted the good news, and literally hugged Daniel in front of everyone, something a normally reserved senior partner never did. Jessica's face glowed with reflected glory, and she was already texting friends about Daniel's brilliant legal strategy. But Daniel felt a strange emptiness beneath the triumph, because he hadn't been brilliant at all. The janitor had been brilliant. He'd just been lucky enough that she decided to help him. The celebratory lunch of the Four Seasons was loud with partner congratulations, expensive wine flowing freely as Richard Whitmore toasted Daniel as the future of Whitmore and Sterling and discussed partnership timing for early next year. Jessica beamed beside him, already planning how they'd announce his partnership at their engagement party next month, calculating the salary increase and bonus structure that would fund their Met Cloisters wedding and St. Bart's honeymoon. Daniel played his part, accepting congratulations graciously, but his mind kept drifting back to the courthouse, to the cafeteria bench where he'd almost ignored a napkin that changed everything. He needed to find that janitor, needed to thank her and understand her story. After lunch, while Jessica went shopping on Madison Avenue and his legal team returned to the office to draft victory memos, Daniel headed back to Manhattan Supreme Court with a purpose that felt more urgent than celebrating his victory. The afternoon shift maintenance staff might know her name, might be able to tell him when she worked next. It was a long shot, but Daniel had to try. The courthouse in afternoon light felt different than morning's electric anticipation. Quieter, sleepier, populated by civil court clerks and attorneys handling routine motions. Daniel asked the security about the night shift maintenance staff, specifically the woman who worked the cafeteria area, but the guards were unhelpful, citing privacy policies and shift schedules they couldn't share. He tried the facilities management office on the basement level, where a tired administrator listened to his request with barely concealed amusement at an attorney trying to track down a janitor. "We have 43 maintenance workers on various shifts, counselor. Unless you have a specific complaint or commendation form to file, I can't help you." Daniel explained it was for a commendation, that she'd been exceptionally helpful, but the administrator just shrugged and suggested he come back during the night shift if he wanted to find her. The bureaucratic stonewalling was frustrating, but not surprising. A corporate attorney looking for a maintenance worker probably seemed odd at best, suspicious at worst. Daniel would have to return tonight after Jessica went home, stake out the cafeteria, and wait for the woman who'd save his career to appear. The evening passed slowly as Daniel and Jessica attended a partnership celebration dinner that Richard Whitmore had arranged at Per Se. 14 courses of molecular gastronomy that Jessica photographed for Instagram, while partners discussed Daniel's flawless legal instincts in finding the retracted study. Daniel accepted their praise without correcting them, knowing that admitting the truth would diminish their view of his brilliance and raise uncomfortable questions about how a janitor had better research skills than his entire legal team. Jessica was effervescent with plans. They'd need to upgrade to a larger apartment in Tribeca, maybe something in Battery Park City with views and space for a home office when Daniel may partner. She wanted to redo her engagement ring with a larger diamond now that they could afford it, and maybe they should consider the Hamptons for summer weekends like the other partners. Daniel nodded along, agreeing to plans that felt increasingly like someone else's life, wondering when success had started feeling like a cage painted in prestige and expensive tastes. Around 10 p.m., he pleaded fatigue and case preparation, dropped Jessica at her Upper East Side apartment with promises to call tomorrow, and directed the cab back to Manhattan Supreme Court. The courthouse at night was nearly empty, except for security guards and cleaning crews pushing maintenance carts through marble hallways. Daniel had changed into jeans and an NYU Law hoodie he kept at the office, trying to look less conspicuous than a Tom Ford suit would be at 11 p.m. in a government building. He found the cafeteria dark and closed, but spotted a maintenance cart outside, someone working inside with industrial cleaners and methodical efficiency. Through the glass doors he could see her, dark hair pulled back, moving with practiced grace as she cleaned tables and mopped floors, the same woman who'd handed him that napkin yesterday. Daniel pushed through the doors, and she looked up startled, probably not expecting anyone at this hour. "I'm sorry to bother you," Daniel started, suddenly uncertain how to explain why a senior attorney was lurking in a closed cafeteria at 11 p.m. "I wanted to thank you for the note about the Martinelli study. You saved my case. You saved my career." The woman studied him with those intelligent brown eyes, and for the first time, Daniel really saw her, not as invisible maintenance staff, but as someone whose presence commanded the room despite her uniform. "I'm glad to help, Mr. Foster," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd even read it." Carmen hadn't expected Daniel Foster to come looking for her, certainly hadn't anticipated him showing up during her shift dressed casually and looking genuinely grateful rather than patronizing. Most attorneys would have taken credit for finding the retraction themselves, never mentioned the anonymous tip. But Foster seemed different, uncomfortable with the praise he'd received, searching for answers about how she'd known to check for retractions. "I used to be an attorney," Carmen found herself explaining, the words coming easier than expected after 3 years of hiding her past. "Corporate defense at Preston and Barnes. I specialize in expert witness testimony and had a case involving retracted studies. So I knew to check the databases when I saw Dr. Chen's testimony on your bench." Foster's expression shifted through surprise, confusion, and something that looked like respect as he processed this information. "You were a corporate attorney? At Preston and Barnes? That's one of the top firms in the city." Carmen nodded, feeling the familiar ache of who she used to be before ethics destroyed everything. Past tense. "I don't practice anymore. Haven't been able to for 3 years now. Not in corporate law anyway." Daniel leaned against the cafeteria table, genuinely curious now rather than just politely grateful, and Carmen found herself telling him more than she'd intended to share. She explained Columbia law, graduating in the top 5%, getting recruited by Preston and Barnes at a starting salary that had made her mother cry with pride. The work had been intense but exciting. Complex litigation, brilliant colleagues, cases that made headlines and shaped policy. She'd been on partner track after just 4 years, working under Malcolm Harrington on a wrongful death case involving a construction company whose negligence had killed 3 workers. "We found an internal memo proving management knew the scaffolding system was defective but didn't fix it because of costs. Malcolm buried it in document production, misclassified it as non-responsive, so opposing counsel wouldn't see it." Carmen's voice had gone flat remembering the moment when idealism had crashed against reality. "I reported it to the senior partners. I thought they'd fire Malcolm, fix the ethics violation, do the right thing." Daniel's expression told her he already knew how the story ended. Anyone who'd survived in corporate law understood the rules, even if they pretended not to. "They fired me instead," Carmen continued, wiping down a table that didn't need cleaning just to have something to do with her hands. "Performance issues," they claimed, though my billable hours were stellar and clients loved my work. Malcolm Harrington kept his name partnership, and I got blacklisted from every major firm in Manhattan, New Jersey, and Connecticut. Whisper campaigns about being difficult, unstable, someone who couldn't handle the pressure. The Bar Association investigated, found insufficient evidence, moved on. She looked directly at Daniel, measuring whether he'd understand or just offer empty sympathy. "I reported evidence tampering to protect dead workers' families, and I lost my career for it. That's how justice works in corporate America. Ethics get you fired. Complicity gets you promoted." Daniel's face had gone pale, and Carmen wondered if she'd misjudge him. If he was another corporate climber who'd view her story as a cautionary tale about keeping quiet rather than an indictment of the system. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Malcolm Harrington. He's the senior partner who referred the Meridian case to our firm. Richard Whitmore considers him a mentor." The revelation hung between them like a physical presence, and Carmen felt the universe's bitter irony. She'd helped Daniel win a case that would ultimately benefit the man who destroyed her career, would earn Malcolm Harrington referral fees, and strengthen his network of corporate defense work. Life's funny that way, Carmen said, trying to keep her voice light though the pain was sharp. I can't practice corporate law, but I can still help others do it. Maybe that's its own kind of justice, or maybe it's just the universe's sick joke. Daniel looked stricken, like he just realized his victory was tainted somehow, and Carmen almost regretted telling him. But she was tired of hiding, tired of being invisible, tired of pretending her story didn't matter just because it was inconvenient for people who benefited from the system that had crushed her. I work pro bono now, she continued. Civil rights cases, deportation defense, tenant advocacy. The law I should have been practicing all along instead of defending pharmaceutical companies and construction firms against liability. I make $28,000 a year cleaning this courthouse, and I do more good now than I ever did at Preston and Barnes with a six-figure salary. Daniel sat down heavily on the cafeteria bench, the same one where he'd been working when Carmen left the note yesterday. The Martinelli retraction is going to win me a partnership, he said slowly, working through the implications. Richard Whitmore is talking about early next year. Significant salary increase, corner office. I'll be defending pharmaceutical companies and corporations for the rest of my career, making millions doing exactly what you walked away from. Carmen heard the question beneath his words. Was he Malcolm Harrington in training, another attorney who'd prioritize profit over principles? That's your choice to make, Mr. Foster, she said carefully. I'm not judging you. Corporate law needs ethical attorneys who won't bury evidence or fabricate testimony. Maybe you can be that person in ways I couldn't. She meant it sincerely, even though part of her wondered if anyone could survive in that world without compromising eventually. The pressure was intense, the reward seductive, and ethics rarely aligned with billable hours or client satisfaction. But you should know what you're getting into. The Meridian case you just won? Those liver failure patients are real people whose lives were destroyed. Whether the drug caused it or not, they're suffering, and you just ensure they won't get compensation, or even acknowledgement from the company that profited from their pain. The words landed hard, and Daniel looked like she'd slapped him, which, in a way, she had. Corporate attorneys learn to abstract human suffering into legal concepts, to view plaintiffs as obstacles rather than people, but Carmen had stripped away that comfortable distance. I never thought about it that way, Daniel admitted, his voice rough. I focused on the legal strategy, the expert testimony, the defense theory. I didn't think about the people. Carmen softened slightly, remembering her own first years in corporate law when she compartmentalized the same way. You're not a bad person, Mr. Foster. You're just playing the game the way everyone plays it. Defend your client, win your case, collect your fee, move on. But the game has consequences, and sometimes those consequences include maintenance workers with law degrees mopping floors because they try to change the rules. She finished cleaning the table and returned her supplies to the cart, signaling that this conversation and this moment of vulnerability was ending. Thank you for coming to say thank you. Most attorneys wouldn't have bothered, but you should go home now. Your fiancé is probably wondering where you are, and you have a partnership to celebrate. Daniel stood slowly, looking like he wanted to say something more, but couldn't find the words. Carmen watched him struggle with whatever revelation had hit him during their conversation. Maybe guilt, maybe awareness, maybe just a cognitive dissonance of success built on someone else's sacrifice. "Can I do anything for you?" he finally asked, the question carrying genuine concern, but also the privilege of someone who believed problems could be solved with money or influence. Carmen almost laughed at the earnestness. What could Daniel Foster possibly do for her? Restore her legal career? Undo 3 years of blacklisting? Make Malcolm Harrington confess to evidence tampering? "I'm fine, Mr. Foster," she said, keeping her voice gentle. "I don't need your charity. I chose this path when I reported Malcolm, and I'd make the same choice again. Go enjoy your victory. You earned it." That last part was a lie. He hadn't earned the victory. She'd handed it to him, but Carmen knew better than to bruise his ego further. Daniel left the cafeteria looking shell-shocked, and Carmen returned to mopping floors while thinking about the convergence of past and present, how the man she destroyed her career trying to stop was now benefiting from her help to someone else. The irony was almost poetic. If poetry could be this bitter. The rest of her shift passed in the familiar rhythm of cleaning. Empty trash, wiped surfaces, mop floors, move to the next hallway, and repeat. Carmen had learned to find meditation to work, a kind of mindfulness that kept anxiety about her ruined career from overwhelming her during long night shifts. Around 2 a.m., she clocked out, changed in the maintenance locker room, and headed for the subway with her laptop bag containing tomorrow's immigration case files. The Guatemalan father's deportation hearing was at 9 a.m., and she needed to review witness testimony one more time before facing the judge who denied asylum to 87% of applicants last year. This was law that mattered, even if it paid nothing and offered no prestige. Her mother had texted earlier saying she was proud, which meant more than any partnership at Whitmore and Sterling ever could. Carmen boarded the N train heading toward Queens, settled into a mostly empty car, and tried not to think about Daniel Foster or the career she'd lost. The past couldn't be changed, and dwelling on it only made the present harder to bear. Better to focus on the clients she could still help, the cases where her knowledge actually made people's lives better rather than just protecting corporate profits. The train rattled through dark tunnels, and Carmen closed her eyes, letting exhaustion take her toward home. The Whitmore and Sterling offices erupted in celebration the next morning as word spread about Daniel's Meridian victory, associates congratulating him in hallways, while partners discussed his partnership timeline. Richard Whitmore had already scheduled a formal announcement for next month, pending votes from the executive committee that were essentially guaranteed after winning a $600 million case. Jessica arrived at his office at 10 a.m. with coffee and pastries, having taken another day off to bask in reflected glory, and spent an hour discussing how they'd announce his partnership in the New York Law Journal Society section alongside their engagement photo. Daniel tried to match her enthusiasm, but couldn't stop thinking about Carmen Rodriguez. That was her name. He'd learned from asking facilities manager this morning with a formal commendation request, and what she'd said about the Meridian plaintiffs being real people whose suffering he'd abstracted into legal strategy. The victory felt hollow now, tainted by knowledge he couldn't unknow, and Jessica's excitement about partnership perks only amplified his discomfort with the whole corporate law trajectory. Jessica noticed his distraction and attributed it to exhaustion from the trial, suggesting they take a long weekend in the Hamptons to celebrate before diving back into work. Daniel agreed absently, already mentally scheduling a return to the courthouse to talk with Carmen again, to learn more about her story and maybe find some way to help her restore her legal career. The idea was forming slowly. If he made partner at Whitmore and Sterling, he'd have influence, could advocate for hiring attorneys who'd faced unjust blacklisting, could push the firm toward more ethical practices. Maybe he could be the change Carmen had tried to be, except from inside the system rather than outside it. The fantasy was appealing but naive, and Daniel knew it. Whitmore and Sterling didn't hire blacklisted attorneys or take on unpopular causes. They defended corporations, protected profits, and maintained relationships with named partners like Malcolm Harrington, who referred lucrative cases. Ethics were fine in theory, but partnership advancement required pragmatism, and Daniel had always been nothing if not pragmatic. Still, meeting Carmen had shaken something loose in him, awakened questions he'd buried beneath ambition and expensive suits. What was the point of success built on others' suffering? What was he actually contributing to the world beyond making rich companies richer? Daniel, are you even listening? Jessica's voice cut through his thoughts, annoyed now rather than concerned. He refocused to find her discussing wedding venues. Something about the Plaza versus Met Cloisters, needing deposits before the prime summer dates were booked. Daniel apologized and assured her he'd support whatever she decided, which earned him a kiss, but also a lingering look that suggested she knew his mind was elsewhere. Jessica left around noon to meet friends for celebratory shopping, and Daniel returned to his case files feeling like he was going through motions rather than actually caring about the pharmaceutical company he was defending or the plaintiffs whose claims he was systematically dismantling. Around 2 p.m., his secretary buzzed to say Malcolm Harrington was on line 1, calling to congratulate him on the Meridian victory. Daniel's hand hovered over the phone, remembering Carmen's story about reporting evidence tampering and losing everything. And for the first time in his career, he seriously considered not taking a senior partner's call. But pragmatism won. Ignoring Malcolm Harrington would be career suicide. So Daniel picked up and accepted congratulations from a man who destroyed Carmen Rodriguez's legal career. Brilliant work finding that retracted study. Malcolm's voice boomed to the phone, hardy and confident like a man who'd never faced consequences for his actions. "Richard told me your team did exceptional research on expert witness credibility. That's exactly the kind of thoroughness we need in complex litigation." Daniel felt sick listening to praise he didn't deserve, knowing Malcolm believed he'd personally discovered the retraction rather than getting it from a janitor Malcolm had helped blacklist. "Thank you, sir. We were lucky to catch it in time." The word lucky felt like admitting the truth without actually admitting it, a coward's compromise. Malcolm continued discussing potential future referrals, another pharmaceutical case in New Jersey, a medical device lawsuit in Connecticut, and Daniel realized his victory had permanently linked him to Malcolm Harrington's network of corporate defense work. Every case he won would strengthen Malcolm's reputation. Every referral would make them more entangled professionally. The partnership he'd worked towards suddenly felt less like achievement and more like imprisonment in a system he'd never questioned until Carmen showed him what it cost to challenge it. "I look forward to working together, Daniel," Malcolm concluded warmly. "You remind me of myself at your age, hungry, brilliant, willing to do whatever it takes to win." The comparison made Daniel want to vomit, but he thanked Malcolm politely and ended the call feeling dirtier than before it began. The afternoon stretched endlessly as Daniel tried to focus on other cases, but found himself Googling Carmen Rodriguez, trying to learn more about her story beyond what she told him. He found her Columbia Law graduation announcement from 2013, a few mentions in legal press about Preston and Barnes hiring promising associates, and then nothing. The blacklist had been thorough and effective. Carmen Rodriguez had simply disappeared from New York legal circles, erased as completely as if she'd never practiced law at all. Daniel searched for the wrongful death case she'd mentioned, but couldn't find public records of the ethics complaint or Malcolm Harrington's response, which wasn't surprising given how thoroughly firms protected their partners from scandal. He did find the case outcome. The construction company had settled for an undisclosed amount after their insurance company pressured them, probably because even without the buried memo, liability was obvious from the circumstances. The workers' families had gotten some compensation, but not justice, and Carmen had lost everything for trying to ensure they got both. Meanwhile, Malcolm Harrington continued practicing law. Malcolm continued burying evidence when it served clients, and the system Malcolm represented rolled on unchanged except for one fewer ethical attorney willing to challenge it. Daniel left the office early, claiming fatigue to his secretary, but really just unable to sit in his corner office, accepting congratulations from colleagues who viewed his success as inspiration. He walked through Manhattan in November cold, not ready to go home, not wanting to see Jessica and pretend enthusiasm about partnership announcements or wedding venues. His feet carried him toward the courthouse almost without conscious decision, though visiting Carmen during her shift probably seemed obsessive at this point. But Daniel needed to understand something, needed to ask questions he couldn't articulate to anyone else. And Carmen was the only person who might have answers. The courthouse in late afternoon was busy with civil court proceedings, attorneys in cheap suits handling landlord-tenant disputes and small claims that would never make headlines or earn partnership bonuses. This was law at street level, messy and human, and real in ways corporate defense never felt. Daniel found himself watching a young public defender argue for bail reduction on behalf of a teenager accused of shoplifting, saw the passion and exhaustion on her face, and realized this attorney probably made 1/10 his salary but slept better at night. When had success become divorced from purpose? When had he started measuring achievement in dollars rather than impact? Carmen wasn't scheduled to work until 10 p.m. according to facilities manager, but Daniel waited anyway, claiming he was preparing for a trial and needed quiet space in the courthouse cafeteria. The security guards recognized him from yesterday's victory and let him through without question. Attorneys apparently granted access to spaces closed to regular people. He spread case files across the bench where Carmen had left her note, pretending to work but really just waiting, hoping she'd arrive early or that he'd somehow miss her schedule. Around 6 p.m., a figure appeared in maintenance uniform, pushing a cart toward the cafeteria, and Daniel's heart jumped before recognizing it was a different woman, older, humming softly to herself as she cleaned. He should leave, should go home, should stop obsessing about someone who'd made it clear she didn't need or want his help. But something kept him there. Some need to understand how Carmen had survived losing everything while he was terrified of losing anything. Maybe that was the difference between them. Carmen had already fallen and learned she could survive it, while Daniel still clung desperately to success because he'd never tested whether there was anything beneath it. The realization was uncomfortable, exposing, and Daniel sat in the darkening cafeteria wondering who he'd become and whether partnership at Whitmore and Sterling was really the future he wanted. The scandal erupted 3 days later, when opposing counsel Mark Davidson filed a motion alleging evidence tampering and misconduct by Daniel's legal team in the Meridian case. The accusations were explosive. Davidson claimed that Daniel had known about the Martinelli retraction months ago, but had strategically waited to reveal it at the last moment to prevent plaintiffs from finding alternative expert testimony, thereby denying them fair opportunity to present their case. The motion included an affidavit from Jessica Martin, Daniel's own paralegal fiancée, stating she'd found the retraction evidence in August, but Daniel had instructed her to keep it confidential until the timing was most advantageous. Daniel read the filing in his office at 6 a.m., his hands shaking with rage and disbelief as he realized Jessica had completely fabricated the affidavit to make herself look competent while destroying his reputation. The accusation wasn't just wrong. It was career-ending if believed, the kind of ethics violation that would cost him his law license, not just his partnership. Richard Whitmore called at 6:15 demanding explanations, and Daniel found himself trying to explain that Jessica had lied, that he'd only learned about the retraction from an anonymous source 2 days before trial, that he'd acted completely ethically within the rules of civil procedure. But explaining the truth meant admitting he'd gotten the evidence from a courthouse janitor, which made him sound either crazy or incompetent for not having found it himself. Whitmore was skeptical. A janitor gave you case-winning evidence. Daniel, that's ridiculous. Just admit your team found it, and the timing was strategic but legal. We'll fight the motion. But Daniel couldn't admit to something that wasn't true, and more importantly, admitting strategic timing would require throwing Jessica under the bus for claiming she found it months ago, which would expose her lie while still leaving him looking manipulative. The situation was a nightmare with no clean exit, and Daniel realized with horrifying clarity that Jessica had engineered this perfectly. If he denied her story, he looked like he was lying to protect himself. If he confirmed it, he looked unethical, and either way, his word against hers in a he-said-she-said that would raise questions about his character. Why would she do this? What did Jessica gain from destroying his reputation while claiming credit for his victory? Unless she wasn't trying to help him at all, but was positioning herself to look competent and ambitious by association with his success, while simultaneously undermining him if it became convenient. The firm erupted in crisis mode. Emergency partner meetings, ethics committee consultations, public relations teams crafting responses to media inquiries about the Meridian case misconduct allegations. Daniel's partnership vote was immediately postponed pending investigation, and suddenly colleagues who congratulated him last week were avoiding eye contact in hallways. Malcolm Harrington called offering support that felt more like surveillance, asking pointed questions about when exactly Daniel had discovered the retraction and why his paralegal story contradicted his own. Richard Whitmore assigned a senior litigation partner to represent Daniel in the ethics investigation, treating him like a defendant rather than a colleague, and the message was clear. Whitmore and Sterling were protecting the firm's reputation, not Daniel's career. If he became a liability, they'd cut him loose without hesitation. Partnership promises be damned. The realization was brutal but not surprising. Corporate law firms were businesses first, and loyalty only extended as far as billing hours and client relationships. Daniel had always known this intellectually, but experiencing it felt different, like watching the beautiful facade of success reveal itself as painted cardboard propped up with money and mutual self-interest. Jessica had disappeared. Not physically. She still came to work, but emotionally she withdrawn, claiming she was devastated by the ethics controversy and had only filed the affidavit because Davidson's investigators had pressured her. She played the victim beautifully, telling anyone who'd listen how difficult it was being caught between loyalty to her fiancé and her obligation to tell the truth to court. Daniel tried confronting her in private, demanding to know why she'd fabricated the August timeline when she knew he'd only learned about the retraction days before trial. Jessica's response was chilling in its calculation. You were going to make partner, and I'd still be a paralegal. Everyone would praise your brilliant research, while I did the actual work finding case citations and checking expert testimony. I deserve credit too, Daniel. And maybe if you'd actually acknowledged my contributions instead of treating me like decorative support, I wouldn't have had to protect myself. The accusation was absurd. Jessica hadn't found the retraction, hadn't contributed to the research strategy, had done exactly what was expected of a senior paralegal and nothing more. But her framing of the situation, ambitious woman denied credit by arrogant male attorney, played perfectly in #MeToo era, and Daniel realized she positioned this to destroy him professionally while elevating herself to martyr status. The courthouse security footage became the critical evidence that would either vindicate or destroy him. Daniel's defense attorney subpoenaed all cafeteria camera recordings from the week before trial, and after 3 days of reviewing footage, found what Daniel had claimed. Video showing Carmen Rodriguez leaving a folded napkin on his briefcase November 18th at 12:47 p.m., showing Daniel picking it up absently and pocketing it without reading, showing him leave the cafeteria at 1:15 p.m. The footage definitively proved Daniel hadn't known about the retraction until he read Carmen's note, probably that evening or the next morning based on when he'd started investigating the Martinelli study. The video also showed Jessica had never been in the cafeteria that day, had never discussed the Meridian case with Daniel in any recorded courthouse location, and therefore couldn't possibly have found the retraction in August as she claimed. Her affidavit was provably false, and suddenly Jessica Martin faced not just career consequences, but potential criminal prosecution for lying in a sworn statement to the court. The tables had turned completely. Except Daniel felt no satisfaction. Only exhaustion with the entire corrupt system that rewarded lies until evidence proved otherwise. The ethics hearing was scheduled for following Monday, and Daniel knew the security footage would exonerate him, but also require explaining who Carmen Rodriguez was and why a courthouse janitor knew enough about expert testimony to spot retracted studies. Richard Whitmore was already demanding answers. Who is this woman? Why would maintenance staff be reading your case files? This looks bizarre. Daniel, like you're hiding something. Daniel couldn't explain without telling Carmen's story, which felt like betraying her privacy, but he also couldn't protect his career without presenting the truth. He called Carmen's number. She'd given it to him reluctantly when he'd insisted on staying in touch, and asked if she'd be willing to testify about finding the retraction and leaving the note. Carmen's laugh was bitter. Testify in a legal proceeding? Daniel, I'm blacklisted from practicing law. You think opposing counsel won't weaponize that against you? They'll claim I'm incompetent or crazy or have some vendetta against corporate lawyers. My testimony will hurt more than help. She was probably right. But Daniel was desperate, drowning in accusations while the only person who could save him refused to surface. Please, he heard himself begging. I don't know how else to prove I'm telling the truth. The security footage shows you leaving the note, but without context, it looks suspicious. I need you to explain why you were reading my documents, how you knew to check for retractions, your legal background that made you competent to evaluate expert testimony. There was a long silence before Carmen sighed deeply. Fine, I'll testify, but you should know this will probably end both our careers. Mine stays dead and yours might join it. The revelation that his key witness was a blacklisted attorney working as maintenance staff sent shockwaves through Whitmore and Sterling's crisis team. Daniel's defense attorney immediately tried to prevent Carmen from testifying, arguing her background would confuse the issues and provide ammunition for accusations of impropriety. A disbarred lawyer. She's not disbarred, Daniel interrupted sharply. Carmen Rodriguez is fully licensed to practice law in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. She was blacklisted from corporate law for reporting ethics violations by her senior partner, but her bar license is active and unblemished. The distinction mattered to him, even if it didn't matter strategically, because Carmen's integrity was the one thing that had remained intact when everything else was destroyed. But his defense attorney was right that Carmen's testimony would raise questions. Why was a licensed attorney working as a janitor? What happened at Preston and Barnes? Would the ethics panel view her as credible or as someone with an axe to grind against corporate law firms? The risks were substantial, but Daniel was out of options. Jessica's lie had backed him into a corner where only the truth could save him. And the truth was complicated, uncomfortable, and involved a woman whose competence exceeded everyone in the room, but whose employment history would be weaponized against her. Daniel made a decision. Carmen would testify, and he'd make damn sure the ethics panel understood she'd save his case through legitimate legal research rather than anything improper. Whether they believe him was another question entirely. The ethics hearing room was smaller than Daniel expected. Just a conference table and 6 chairs where his professional fate will be decided by partners from other firms serving on the Bar Association's ethics committee. Jessica sat on the opposite side, looking pale but defiant. Her attorney beside her preparing to argue that she'd acted in good faith, reporting what she believed to be unethical timing by Daniel's legal team. Mark Davidson, the plaintiff's attorney who'd filed the original misconduct motion, attended as a witness, clearly hoping to overturn his courtroom loss through ethics violations. Richard Whitmore sat in the gallery behind Daniel, looking grim, his presence sending a clear message that Whitmore and Sterling's reputation hung in the balance. The panel chair called the hearing to order, and Daniel felt his stomach knot with anxiety. His entire career compressed into the next 2 hours, 8 years of work potentially destroyed by his fiancée's calculated betrayal. Then Carmen Rodriguez walked in, and the room went silent. She dressed in a conservative navy suit, probably her last surviving outfit from her Preston and Barnes days, and she looked every inch the attorney she'd once been rather than maintenance staff. Carmen carried a leather portfolio, moved with quiet confidence, and when she was sworn in, identified herself clearly. Carmen Rodriguez, Juris Doctor from Columbia Law School, admitted to practice in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, currently employed by the New York State Facilities Department in Maintenance Services. The panel members exchanged glances, clearly wondering how an attorney ended up cleaning courthouses, but Carmen's demeanor commanded respect despite the unconventional biography. Daniel's attorney began the questioning, establishing Carmen's legal education, her 4 years at Preston and Barnes, her specialization in expert witness testimony and complex litigation. Then came the crucial questions about the Meridian case. When had she first seen Daniel's documents? Why had she been reading case files? How had she known to check for the Martinelli retraction? Carmen's answers were precise, factual, completely professional. She'd seen the documents spread on the cafeteria bench during her cleaning rounds, had recognized the case from public filings, and had noticed Dr. Chen's expert testimony cited a study she remembered being retracted from a previous case she'd worked involving research fraud. I left Mr. Foster a note because the retraction was directly relevant to his defense strategy, and his legal team appeared to have missed it during their research, Carmen testified, her voice steady and authoritative. I did this as one attorney helping another, not as maintenance staff overstepping boundaries. I am fully qualified to evaluate expert testimony and medical research standards. It was my specialty at Preston and Barnes. The panel members listened intently, and Daniel could see them reassessing their initial impression of Carmen as some janitor who'd gotten lucky. Jessica's attorney tried to undermine her credibility during cross-examination. Ms. Rodriguez, isn't it true you were fired from Preston and Barnes for performance issues? Carmen's response was devastating in its calm precision. I was fired for reporting senior partner Malcolm Harrington for evidence tampering in a wrongful death case. The performance issues cited were pretextual retaliation. I filed a complaint with the Bar Association, which found insufficient evidence to discipline Mr. Harrington, but also didn't dispute my account of events. The admission hung in the air, and Daniel saw the panel members' expressions shift as they understood exactly why Carmen was working maintenance instead of practicing corporate law. She'd sacrificed her career for ethics, the same ethics this panel was supposedly convened to protect. The security footage was played next, showing clearly that Carmen had left a note November 18th, and that Jessica had never been in the cafeteria that day or any day that week according to timestamp recordings. Jessica's attorney tried to argue the footage was inconclusive, that discussions about the retraction could have happened elsewhere, but the timeline didn't support her story. Daniel's team hadn't started investigating the Martinelli study until November 19th, the day after Carmen left the note, and all research occurred in the subsequent 48 hours before trial. Jessica's claim that she'd found the evidence in August was provably false, and her affidavit was perjury by any reasonable standard. The panel chair turned to Jessica. Ms. Martin, can you explain the discrepancy between your sworn statement and the security footage? Jessica's composure cracked, tears appearing as she claimed she'd been confused about dates, had genuinely believed she'd found the retraction months ago, only wanted to ensure the truth came out. It was a pathetic performance that convinced nobody, and Daniel felt nothing but disgust watching her lie under oath while destroying what remained of her credibility. Carmen sat quietly in the gallery, her expression neutral, and Daniel wondered what she thought watching this train wreck unfold. The panel deliberated for 90 minutes before returning with their findings. Daniel Foster had acted ethically and in accordance with civil procedure rules. Jessica Martin had filed a false affidavit and would be referred to Bar Association for discipline, likely including disbarment. And opposing counsel Mark Davidson's misconduct allegations were dismissed as without merit. The victory should have felt triumphant. But Daniel just felt exhausted and empty. His career saved, but his engagement destroyed, and his reputation forever tainted by the investigation. Richard Whitmore approached him afterward, relief visible on his face, saying the partnership vote will proceed next month as planned now that the ethics cloud had cleared. But Daniel found himself saying the words before he'd fully formed the thought. I don't think I want partnership at Whitmore and Sterling anymore, Richard. The senior partner stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Who turned down partnership after winning a $600 million case? You're upset about Jessica, Whitmore said soothingly. That's understandable. Take some time. Think about it. Don't make rash decisions. But Daniel knew this wasn't rash. Meeting Carmen had shown him there were attorneys who chose principles over profits, who'd rather clean floors than compromise ethics, and that realization had made his entire career trajectory look hollow and meaningless. Carmen was leaving the building when Daniel caught up to her outside, November cold biting through his suit jacket. She looked tired but also lighter somehow, like testifying had released something she'd been carrying for 3 years. Thank you for coming, Daniel said inadequately, knowing those words couldn't capture his gratitude for her willingness to expose herself publicly when she'd worked so hard to stay invisible. Carmen smiled slightly. You needed the truth told, and I needed to stop hiding from my past. We helped each other. Daniel wanted to say more, wanted to ask what she'd do now, whether the hearing had changed anything for her, whether she regretted leaving the note that had set all this chaos in motion. But before he could speak, Carmen continued, The panel chair asked to meet with me afterward. Apparently, he was impressed by my testimony and knows a civil rights firm looking for experienced litigators. He's going to make an introduction. Carmen received an offer from Rodriguez and Associates, a Brooklyn civil rights firm that valued lawyers who had sacrificed careers for their principles. The $95,000 salary wasn't corporate money, but it gave her something far more important, the chance to practice ethical law again and fight for people who truly needed help. After 3 years of being blacklisted, she felt like she was finally reclaiming the attorney she was meant to be. Daniel soon faced his own reckoning. Despite winning the Meridian case, he declined partnership at Whitmore and Sterling, unable to justify spending his life protecting corporate profits. Word spread quickly, making him undesirable to other big firms but highly attractive to public interest organizations. Brooklyn Defender Services offered him a senior attorney position, and though the pay was a fraction of his old salary, the work felt real and meaningful. He accepted, ending his engagement to Jessica and walking away from a career that no longer matched his values. On his last night at the firm, Daniel met Carmen for dinner to celebrate their fresh starts. They talked for hours about their shared Brooklyn roots, their parents' sacrifices, and how they'd both been drawn to corporate law, before realizing conflicted with who they were. When Daniel asked Carmen to see him again, she said yes, and both felt the quiet beginning of something new. 6 months later, Daniel proposed in the same courthouse cafeteria where Carmen's warning note had changed everything. They married in a small ceremony, surrounded by people who understood how hard they'd fought to get there, both in love and in their careers. 2 years later, Carmen, now a partner at her firm and pregnant with their first child, argued a landmark police misconduct case before the Second Circuit. Her success brought real change and protected thousands of people. Watching her from the gallery, Daniel realized this was true success. Not wealth or status, but meaningful work, shared values, and a life built on justice. And it had all begun with a simple note written by someone brave enough to do the right thing.